Greetings from beautiful Waikiki. I decided to take advantage of the fact that airline flights round trip to Hawaii were $39 and I can stay in a five-star resort for 12 bucks a night. So I'm talking to you at 7 o'clock in the morning here in the islands. So let's go ahead and get started with some of the questions that 8 different students emailed me yesterday, and I will address them. These are things that they were having trouble finding in the textbook, or maybe things that were from my notes, and I never had a chance to talk about them in class. So hopefully this will take care of most people's questions. The first one is, what explains the success of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt? And what I'm going for there is FDR and Lincoln are both considered great presidents, possibly 2 of the 3 greatest presidents, and it's because they governed during a time of crisis, so they had an opportunity for greatness. I sent you some very long notes about Teddy Roosevelt, my all-time favorite president. And Roosevelt is considered one of the greats, and he did not govern during a time of crisis. So he didn't have that advantage like the Civil War or the Great Depression or World War II. He was extremely successful and made a huge difference because of the sheer force of his personality and his drive and ambition. And especially, of course, the key with Teddy Roosevelt was the desire to make the federal government regulate business and regulate other aspects of our free enterprise capitalist society that was not really working in the best interests of average people. They were working in the best interests of millionaires and, the owners of huge factories and things like that. So the kind of legislation he pushed for broke up monopolies, which was called trust busting, regulated food and medicine, and got rid of child labor, got some laws about safety in the workplace, and 40-hour weeks, some regulations on that sort of thing. So anyway, that's kind of my point. Lincoln and FDR were great because they had an opportunity for greatness and they rose to the occasion. Teddy Roosevelt did not have that same opportunity, yet he was still able to achieve greatness. Okay, on what basis does a presidential nominee choose a vice presidential nominee? And I can simply tell you the right answer to that question is the basis for choosing a VP is who can give you the best chance to win. It's not about finding the person that you think would do the best job if something happened to you, like you died in office. That is not the way it works. The way it works is you choose somebody that can help you win the general election. So generally, if you're from the North, you'd want to pick a Southerner to help you carry the Southern states. If you're from the East, you probably want to pick a Westerner, help you carry the Western states. A lot of times people have been chosen. Let's take the example of John F. Kennedy. His campaign experts had looked at the electoral map. They knew it was going to be very close in that election with Richard Nixon. And they said, we think it could all come down to Texas. Texas is a state with a lot of electoral votes, and we feel like we have to win it. So they only considered Texans for VP, and he picked Lyndon Johnson. And sure enough, Lyndon Johnson was able to give him enough votes in Texas to carry Texas. And as it turned out, if he hadn't carried Texas, he would have lost the election. So he made the right call. And the irony of that is that Kennedy and Johnson hated each other. He would have never picked Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president, except that he knew he needed him to win the election. So that's the criteria by which presidential nominees choose VP nominees. Why did patronage decline? You might remember that patronage is the idea of once you get elected president, you can hand out government jobs. Patronage was typically government jobs. So you might remember the discussion about Andrew Jackson and the spoils system, where when he was elected, he essentially fired everyone in the federal government, all the way down to local postmasters, and replaced them with his people, people who had spent a lot of time and effort trying to get him elected. And pretty much all presidents did that to a greater or lesser degree. Probably nobody did as much as Jackson did. But everybody did it until the late 1800s, when we finally passed civil service reforms. And those laws made probably 98, 99% of all government jobs based on merit. It almost eliminated patronage. There are still patronage jobs. When the president gets elected, there's some really good jobs like U.S. ambassadors. U.S. ambassadors are notorious for being big supporters of the president, usually big financial supporters, because literally the president can pick anybody to be an ambassador to a country. So there are still patronage jobs out there, but most of the jobs that we think of as government jobs, the person didn't get the job because they knew somebody. They knew the president. They knew their local member of Congress. The jobs have qualifications. You got to have a certain degree. You got to have certain years of experience. You take a civil service exam. You've got to do pretty well on the civil service exam to be considered for the job. So the job is basically based on merit, and patronage has kind of gone out the door for the most part. Okay, I've got a question on this test about what is the greatest influence or mark the president can leave on the government once he has left office? And the answer to that question is judicial appointments, the appointment of federal judges. Most federal judges are still going to be on the job 15, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years after the president has left office. So the mark that a president leaves on the federal judiciary, the appointment of all those federal judges, that has the most long-lasting influence that a president can make on the federal government long after he's left office. Okay, and the last one from this particular student is executive agreements and executive orders. Okay. The big advantage of executive agreements and orders is that they can be done very quickly. These are decisions made by the president that do not require Congress passing them. And so a president can respond to crises like the coronavirus. Trump has handed down a number of executive orders. These have the effect of law, but they do not require any congressional passage. So an executive order is basically anything that addresses a problem or an issue here at home in the 50 states, in America. A president can hand down an executive order. And so, the whole idea of once the coronavirus hit, okay, we're going to delay tax returns being filed for 90 days. So Trump just signs an executive order. April 15th will no longer be the date for taxes. It'll be May, June, July. It'll be July 15th. And so he doesn't need Congress to pass a bill delaying the tax deadline. He can just sign an executive order and bam, it happens. Now, an executive agreement is very similar to an executive order, but it has to do with foreign policy. So executive agreements are the agreements that a president can make with his counterpart in another country, like the president of that country or the prime minister or premier or whatever they call themselves. So remember, there's a discussion about treaties, and one of the differences between the House and the Senate is that the Senate gets to ratify treaties that are negotiated by the president, and the House doesn't get to do that. The problem is the founding fathers said a treaty has to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. So that means the president has to get a certain number of his political enemies, the senators from the other party, as well as all the senators from his party, to approve a treaty. And treaties are extremely difficult to get passed, essentially, to get ratified, because you need 67 votes, 2/3 of the 100 senators. So presidents hardly ever negotiate treaties anymore. So if you were going to try and negotiate a treaty with 40 different countries, forget the treaty and just negotiate 40 different executive agreements. Then the president can bypass the Senate altogether. So if Trump wants to try to agree with Putin on something, his buddy Vladimir Putin from Russia, he and Putin can simply negotiate an agreement. They both sign it, and bam, that becomes the policy of the United States government toward Russia. One limitation of an executive agreement. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage is, a treaty is forever. An executive agreement is only in effect as long as Trump is in office or as long as Putin is in office. It's an agreement between those two leaders, not really between those two countries. So if Joe Biden winds up winning the presidency in 2020, here's what you can count on. Most of the executive orders that were signed by Trump will disappear like in one day. And most of the executive agreements that he negotiated with foreign leaders, those will be wiped out at the stroke of a pen by Joe Biden pretty much on his first day in office. So there are changes in the short run from executive orders and executive agreements, but in the long run, they really don't have much effect because the next president can wipe them all out by the stroke of a pen. Okay, fascinating stuff. I know I'm loving this. So let's move on to the next thing. How has the development of primary elections changed how candidates run for president? And what function does Iowa and New Hampshire play? Okay, so primary elections have completely changed how people run for president. For most of our history, party leaders basically dictated who the Democratic and Republican nominees were for president. We have presidential nominating conventions, and delegates from all 50 states attend these conventions. But before we had primary elections in the last 50, 60 years or so, the party bosses basically told the delegates how they were going to vote. They had enormous influence over them. And so basically the presidential candidates were chosen by an elite few party leaders. That is no longer the case. That was when we had party-centered politics. Now, remember that from the last exam? Now we have candidate-centered politics. The party leaders have no influence on it, none. It'll be Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden based on how many delegates they earn in all these different primary elections in all 50 states. And if Biden earns the most delegates, if he earns a majority of the delegates, he will be the nominee, and it doesn't matter what the party leaders think. And the same with Bernie Sanders. If you've been paying attention to this, the party leaders don't want Bernie Sanders because they think he won't be able to beat Trump. He's too liberal. But they can't dictate that Joe Biden wins. They may want Joe Biden to win, but Biden simply has to do better in the primaries than Bernie Sanders does. And if he gets more votes than Bernie, he'll earn more delegates than Bernie. And if that happens and he gets a majority, then he will be the Democratic nominee for president, and Sanders won't be. So we still have national nominating conventions, but they really don't serve any purpose, because in every presidential election since 1972, we knew who the nominee was going to be before the convention ever even started, because they had all these primary elections and they'd earned the delegates, and the nomination was clinched before the convention ever started. So there's really no point even having these conventions, except it's a really nice party for the people who go. But the media barely even covers the conventions anymore. All they really cover are the acceptance speeches by the VP and by the president from both parties. That's about the only thing that really gets on the regular network stations anymore. Okay, enough about that. Oh, the importance of Iowa, New Hampshire. Iowa's first, New Hampshire is second. Iowa has a caucus. It's a little different than a primary, but it's still basically you're trying to get votes. Whoever gets the most votes wins. So it's really not that different. And you don't need to know the difference between a primary and a caucus. But Iowa is first, so it's most important. New Hampshire is second, so it's second most important. And generally, if you don't do well in at least Iowa or New Hampshire, you're going to have a very difficult time winning your party's nomination for president. And most people who have won the nomination did very well in both Iowa and New Hampshire. They might not have won it, but they at least finished pretty close to the top. The candidates start running in Iowa and New Hampshire more than a year before the election, actually more like a year and a half before the election. They don't even campaign in very many other states. They just focus on Iowa and New Hampshire because that's how important those first two are. They give you momentum, and momentum is what allows you to do well in the future primaries. If you do badly in those first two, you have no momentum, and that means you're not going to do very well in the primaries that come after that. Okay, the three functions of Congress according to me, and of course that is lawmaking, the legislative function, representation. You might remember I talked a lot in all the classes about the representation function, you know, casework, which is constituent service, what I call the errand boy function of Congress, helping you with your government problems. And of course, another aspect of representation is voting the way the people want you to. You are their representative. So a lot of people think that means you should represent their views in Washington. So the representation function, and then the last one is oversight. Congress is supposed to oversee the executive branch. Congress passes the laws, but the executive branch carries them out. Congress is supposed to make sure that the executive branch carries them out the way Congress intended for them to do. But Congress does a horrible job at oversight. The voters don't seem to care about it. Congress doesn't spend much time on it, and they're pretty much a failure at this third function of Congress. Okay, now I've got a question here about trustee and delegate. We were just talking about the representation function, and so if you believe in the delegate philosophy, this came from an English guy named Edmund Burke, who wrote a letter to his constituents in Bristol about what kind of representative he should be. And the two types are are delegate and trustee. A delegate is somebody who, every time they vote, they just want to figure out, what do a majority of the people in their district want? How does a majority of the voters want you to vote? And then you just simply vote that way. You don't even use your own judgment. You don't have to think about it. You just do what the people want you to do. And obviously the trustee philosophy is you take the public's opinion into account, but the final decision has to be based on your own judgment, your own conscience, what you think is right. Just do the right thing as you see it. The voters are supposed to trust you. They hired you, they elected you to use your best judgment to make the decision that you believe is in their best interest. And if a majority of the public doesn't think it's in their best interest, your job is to explain it to them and help convince them that even though you did something that was unpopular, it was really in the best interest of the people. And obviously, if you're a trustee, it can be very difficult to get reelected, because if you cast unpopular votes, you generally get beat in the next election. Now, we're talking about on issues that people really care about. You know, in any given year, there might only be 3 or 4 issues the public really tunes in on and really cares about. You pretty much need to vote the way the voters in your district want you to vote on those 3 or 4 issues that they really care about. On the other 300 or 400 issues that most people don't know anything about, you can vote however you want to. You can vote the way the people who give you money want you to vote, which often happens. Your contributors have a great deal of influence over you because the public doesn't even care how you vote. Or you can vote your conscience, do what you think is right, because even though maybe a majority of the people in your district wouldn't support your position, they really don't care about it, so it doesn't really matter. The congressman I used to work for when I was in college, Wes Watkins, said 99% of the votes that he ever cast in Congress, he could have voted any way he wanted to because the public didn't know anything about that issue. They didn't care how he voted, but there's a critical 1% of issues that the public does really care about. And you kind of need to vote the way the voters want you to on those issues, or you run the risk of losing in the next election. Okay. Oh, there's a third one mentioned in your textbook, and I think actually it's on the test. The Politico function. I'm sorry, the Politico philosophy. And a Politico, that's a simple idea. Sometimes you're a delegate, sometimes you're a trustee. So people who are a combination of a trustee and a delegate, they would be considered a Politico. All right. Let's see. Okay, this person wants to know about the impeachment process. You don't have to know a lot in depth about the impeachment process. In fact, I think I have one question, and it pretty much goes like this. The impeachment process begins in the House of Representatives, always in the House. And it requires a simple majority vote of the House of Representatives to impeach a president. Now, impeachment does not mean removal from office. An impeachment is like an indictment in a criminal case. It's simply a formal accusation of wrongdoing. That's what it means to be impeached. Donald Trump was impeached. He was accused of wrongdoing. Bill Clinton was impeached. He was accused of wrongdoing. Neither one of them were removed from office. The removal process means a trial, and that trial happens in the United States Senate. So if a president's impeached by the House of Representatives, simple majority vote, which is 50% plus one, then the impeachment articles, because there could be more than one. In the case of Trump, there were 2 articles of impeachment. If he gets convicted on either one of them, then he will be removed from office. But the 2 articles of impeachment that passed in the House were sent to the Senate, and they conducted a trial that lasted about a week. And then the Senate voted, and to remove Trump from office, it would have taken a 2/3 vote of the Senate, not a simple majority, but 2/3, which means 67 senators out of 100. And if you'll recall, for Trump, the largest number of votes that either article of impeachment got was like 47 or 48. I think one got 47, one got 48. You needed 67, so it fell like 20 votes short. And it was the same with Bill Clinton. There were 3 articles of impeachment. The most popular article, the one that got the most votes, was 50. So Clinton fell 17 votes short of being removed from office. So it is very difficult to impeach a president. And by the way, you can impeach like a federal judge. Impeachment can happen to more than just the president. We've had, I think, around a dozen federal judges that have been impeached in the 230 plus year history of the United States. So impeachment's very uncommon. And certainly removal from office is extremely uncommon. Okay, enough about that. Let's see. Oh, when we were talking about trustee and delegate, and I mentioned Edmund Burke, that's what I mean on the review sheet by Burke's dilemma. Burke's dilemma simply means this: do you vote the way the people want you to, or do you vote according to your conscience? Do you vote according to what you believe is right? And that's a dilemma. In the letter that Burke wrote to the people of Bristol, he said, "What I owe you is my best judgment. You elected me to use my best judgment to do what I thought was right." And that's the way he voted when he was in Parliament. And what do you think happened to Edmund Burke? He got his butt beat in the next election, and he didn't get reelected because he was unpopular, because he didn't vote on important issues the way people wanted him to vote. So, you know, I guess that was a lesson to people that came after him. Do you want to do the right thing, or do you want to do the popular thing? And most of them want to do the popular thing because they like their job and they'd like to keep it. Okay, now this person's also asking about the concept of representation. This is a different way to think about representation, not just trustee and delegate, but actual representation and virtual representation. So one way you can think about the concept of representation is that if a district is made up of a lot of middle-class people and it's mostly Caucasians, then you would elect a white middle-class person to represent you, because most of the people who live in the district are white and middle-class. So you would say that person, you know, is actually representative of the people in his district. Like maybe it's a big farming district and he happened to be a farmer. Well, you know, it just makes sense. He'd have a better chance of getting elected than some city slicker would, because most people are like farm people, and so they would want to elect a fellow farmer. Or maybe if the guy's dad was a farmer and he grew up that way. That's the concept of actual representation. The concept of virtual representation basically means this. You don't have to have the same race or the same gender or the same background, like socioeconomic background, as the people in your district. But if you vote the way the people in your district want you to vote, then you would be considered a virtual representative. And so even though maybe you're rich, you grew up wealthy, and most people in your district are poor or middle class, as long as you vote in the best interest of the poor and middle class, they're really not going to care that you grew up rich. So I'll give you an example. Some of the biggest champions of the poor in the history of Congress were actually multimillionaires. And they just, you know, had a conscience that felt like the government should do more for poor people. And you would think they wouldn't care about poor people because they grew up rich. But it's kind of weird how that works. Many of the greatest champions of the poor were some of the wealthiest members of Congress. So that's what we mean by virtual representation. And if you were from a district that had a lot of middle-class people in it, and you were middle-class yourself, that would be an example of actual representation. Okay. And now for the last page, the 4 norms of Congress. And here's what they are. Specialization, which is basically the committee system. The way to make your mark in Congress is to get on a committee and stay there for 2 or 3 decades, and you become a specialist on what that committee deals with. You're on the agriculture committee, you become an agriculture expert, and other people look to you for your opinion on agricultural issues, and you have a lot of influence over them. So that's the specialization norm. Another one is courtesy. Members of Congress are expected to be courteous to each other. And if you're not courteous, there's a price to be paid because you violate a norm. Remember, a norm is an expected pattern of behavior. So that's another norm of Congress. Another one is, okay, let's see, specialization and courtesy and seniority. Seniority is very big. Historically, seniority was huge. All the leaders of Congress were basically the most senior members of Congress. Seniority is not nearly as important as it used to be, but it's still very important. The leaders in Congress are not going to be people who've only been there a few years. They are going to have been there quite a while. and developed a lot of friends and a lot of influence. But it used to be the Speaker of the House was the member of the majority party who had been in the House the longest. It was the person with the most seniority. And in the early 20th century, we got away from that because there was a realization that the most senior members weren't necessarily the best members or the most talented leaders. And so now we've gone to the situation we have now where there's a secret ballot and the members of the majority party will elect their leaders, the members of the minority party will elect their leaders, and it's all by secret ballot, so no one can be punished for how they vote because no one knows how anyone voted. And so as a result, many times the leader, the majority leader or the minority leader, is going to be somebody who is maybe not among the most senior members from their party. They typically have quite a bit of seniority, but there could be quite a few that have more seniority, but they were chosen by their fellow members of Congress because they thought they would do the best job, that that person would do the best job. Okay, and the last one is reciprocity. I've got a question on this test about, to me, one of the most famous examples of reciprocity, and that's log rolling. Log rolling means vote trading. So reciprocity, when you are exercising reciprocity with someone, a reciprocal arrangement, a reciprocal agreement, it basically means you scratch my back, I scratch yours, which has famously been called recently quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. You do something, and then I'm going to expect you to do something for me in return. Swapping favors. Log rolling is swapping votes. It's simply vote trading. Like, let's say there's a farm bill, and I'm from New York City. I don't give a rip about farm bills. But then there's another bill about, say, federal aid for mass transit, like subways. Well, I'm from New York. I really care about the federal money giving more money to New York to help with maintaining and building subways. So I could go to the farm guy and say, hey, I'll vote the way you want me to on this farm bill if you'll vote the way I want you to on this mass transit bill. You know, if you're from a farm area, you don't care about mass transit. There's no mass transit out in the countryside. So that kind of log rolling goes on all the time. And members of Congress keep very close track on who they have traded votes with. Because once you make an agreement to trade votes, it's going to be a disaster if you forget to follow through on your end of it. They have already voted the way you wanted them to vote. You had better remember to vote on this other issue the way they wanted you to vote. And if you forget to do that, you have really shot yourself in the foot. They won't trust you again. They'll tell other people you're not a man of your word or a woman of your word. And, you know, you're going to be in a huge mess. Okay, so, oh, no, we got two more. Here's one about incumbency. This is from chapter 11, the power of incumbency. An incumbent is somebody who's been in Congress who's running for re-election. And you might remember when I talked about this in class, I talked about how the incumbents have basically rigged the system to guarantee that they will get reelected. You might remember me talking about why do Americans Congress but love their congressmen? You know, more than 80% of Americans say they dislike Congress, but about 95% of Americans vote to reelect their own congressman. And that's because of the advantages of incumbency. And I mentioned a bunch of them, like pork barrel legislation, you know, doing special projects for the people in your district that you can claim credit for. But I also talked about in the House of Representatives, the greatest incumbent advantage is gerrymandering. Remember gerrymandering? Politically motivated reapportionment. So basically, most districts, about 90% of all the districts in America, the House districts, are gerrymandered. They are drawn by the state legislature in that state, whichever party controls the state legislature, they'll be drawn with political motivations in mind. So in Georgia, the Republicans control the Georgia State House, and they draw the congressional districts to create as many Republican districts as possible and minimize the number of districts that have a Democratic majority. And so as a result, almost every district in Georgia either is very strongly Democrat or very strongly Republican. And so once you get elected as either a Democrat or Republican, you're virtually impossible to beat, right? Because the person from the other party has no chance to beat you. The district was drawn to make sure that you win. And so here in 2020, the Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives from Georgia are going to ask their fellow Republicans in the Georgia state legislature to draw districts that are going to be even more favorable for the next 10 years for Republicans to protect their job. And as a result, it's going to be almost impossible to get rid of them. It's extremely frustrating, and that really explains why it's so hard to defeat an incumbent. In the Senate, you don't have gerrymandering because obviously the shape of the district is your entire state. Senators represent the entire state, but they still have all the other incumbent advantages, like the most money. The people who make campaign contributions mostly give to incumbents. That's because incumbents have the best chance to win because the system is rigged to virtually guarantee their reelection. So they have the further advantage of having the most money. They have the most name recognition. So they're covered by the news media and they don't have to pay for that. The news media covers members of Congress because that's their job, to cover what the government does. If I'm challenging a member of Congress, the only way I get mentioned in the media is to buy ads, and that costs a ton of money. And they aren't nearly as influential as somebody whose activities are covered by the newspaper or the TV station as just part of, delivering the news. So they have much better name recognition. And we know one of the biggest factors in why anybody wins an election is if they have the greatest level of name recognition. So there's just a million reasons why the incumbents have virtually rigged our system to guarantee that they never lose, or they almost never lose. All right. And the last one, this is also from Chapter 11, Shaw versus Reno. Remember we were talking about gerrymandering before? Well, this was a Supreme Court case in 1995 from the state of Georgia. And basically, here was the issue. After the 1990 census, Georgia created a new congressional district because Georgia was a fast-growing state, so we were entitled to an additional representative. The new 11th district from Georgia after the 1990 census was drawn to be mostly black, about a 70% black district. Well, that means it's a guaranteed win for the Democrats because about 90% of all black voters vote for Democrats. Well, the Republicans were pretty pissed about this, and they challenged it. They took the case to the Supreme Court, and here was their beef. Not that the district was drawn to benefit Democrats, because in 1990, the Democrats controlled the Georgia state legislature, so they could do the gerrymandering to, draw the districts to the advantage of the Democrats. But the Republicans sued because they said this was gerrymandering for racial reasons, racial gerrymandering. They weren't just creating a Democratic district, they were creating a Democratic district in which white candidates would have very little chance to win because the majority of all the voters were black. And of course, a lot of black people said, hey, most districts in America have a white majority and a white person is virtually guaranteed to win. This is really just the same thing, except this time it benefits us as a minority. Well, the Supreme Court voted in favor of the Republicans and said basically states can continue to gerrymander, but not for racial reasons. So basically the significance of Shaw versus Reno is no racial gerrymandering. Okay, you cannot create districts where you've gone out of your way to create a black majority, or for that matter, gone way out of your way to create a white majority or a Latino majority. So no racial gerrymandering. That's really all you need to know about Shaw versus Reno. Okay, I think we pretty much covered the waterfront from these 8 folks that I asked to submit questions. So I have the test all loaded into Georgia View. So I'll be sending an email that has, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sending an email that will give you a link to this video that I just made. And there'll also be a link on Georgia View. But the test, you have to go into Georgia View. And it'll say test 3, chapter 11 and 12. And you click on it. Just be ready when you click on it. You need 75 uninterrupted minutes because you can't stop the clock. And I think that you'll have your score pretty much as soon as you submit your test, because it grades it automatically and very quickly, as I understand it. You can't begin the test until 8 a.m. tomorrow, and you have to be done by 11:59 p.m., 1 minute before midnight on Sunday night. So there you have it. Good luck on the test. I hope this little review session was helpful, and I'll be talking to you some more after the exam is over. By the way, if you want to do a movie review, please email that to me by the time that you take the exam. So just send it directly to my inbox, and I would really, really appreciate it if you would say which class you're in, like Tuesday, Thursday, 10:50, Monday, Wednesday, 1:40. That way I don't have to look up and see which class you're actually in when I go to add it to your score. So anyway, good luck on the test. Sorry that we're having to do it online. I really kind of miss you guys. I enjoy the students face to face, and I don't really get to interact with you this way. So just hang in there, stay safe, and I'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.